Mossy Earth podcast. I'm Ria, and in this space we discuss nature restoration and how to help you reduce your environmental footprint. In this episode, Tiago, one of our conservation biologists, currently researching about the different ecosystems we can focus on for our projects at Mossy Earth, sat down with a very special guest that is about to share with us his knowledge on freshwater ecosystems and migratory fish.
Hi, I'm Tiago and I'm here with Jakko Erkinaro. Jakko is a research professor at LUK, the Natural Resources Institute, Finland, and he is involved in monitoring and research programs on wild Atlantic salmon rivers, but also in restoration programs on regulated rivers. His fields of research cover both freshwater and marine phases of salmonid fishes, for which he has published more than 100 peer-reviewed scientific articles. Jakko, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here discussing these interesting and timely topics.
Yeah, so just to give our listeners a little bit of context, I started to learn really about how threatened these freshwater ecosystems really are and the different kinds of solutions that are being proposed to address this. And I started reading about your research, and I also saw a presentation you gave at the conference about dam removals. And I thought that you would be a great guest for our podcast, given that you've been working in this field for a long time and have made such interesting contributions. But just before we dig into the actual conservation issues, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself? So what do you do and how did you actually end up doing research in this field?
Well, I've been interested in nature and wildlife and in particular fish since I've been very, very young. My father is a biologist, so I was used to be in the nature. I'm also a very keen fisherman myself, so I started to be very interested in addition to fishing, also in fish biology and the whole freshwater and aquatic ecosystems in general. So gradually I started to study biology and then after some interesting situations where just sheer luck step in, I got into this research field of freshwaters and salmonid fishes, and especially the Atlantic salmon and other salmonid fishes in the northern river systems. And that's what I'm doing now. My main topics are the salmon population, Atlantic salmon populations in the north, which means the northernmost Finland, northernmost Norway, the Barents Sea area, and then connected river systems with other fish species like anadromous brown trout as well, and also the Baltic Sea area. And in Finland we have so much more river systems running to the Baltic Sea area compared to the north. But in the Baltic Sea we have lots of regulated rivers with hydropower development, lots of dams, all kinds of issues for anadromous salmonid fishes. So this is a very challenging field of research and work as well. So that's what I do at the moment.
Yeah, it's really interesting work. So you mentioned anadromous fish, and so here we're speaking about fish migration. Could you just explain a little bit what that term means for people who are not so familiar with migration and migration in fish?
Yeah, anadromous fish means that they reproduce, they spawn in fresh water, and then they spend some years as juveniles in fresh water. Then they migrate to sea, grow big, return back to the fresh water for spawning. So this is typically something that people could think of like Atlantic salmon would be a perfect example of that. So that means migratory and in this case anadromous fish species.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think for people who are not so familiar with the topic as well, maybe it's interesting to discuss a little bit why do these fish migrate in the first place, you know?
Well, animals and fish in particular, they migrate between different habitats because they do have some needs that are not satisfied in the present habitat. They need to get something better. They need to reach some resources that are useful and precious for them for certain part of their life cycle, like for spawning, for feeding, for overwintering, or for growing quick and fast, and whatever the situation is during the life cycle. They require certain conditions which they can reach by migrating to another habitat. And like I just told you about the Atlantic salmon, they will migrate between the spawning habitat and the juvenile habitat in freshwater to the sea, which is the growing habitat. They grow enormously quick in the sea, and they, after the fast growing period, they return as big fat spawners to the rivers again. So this is a typical example of different requirements during the different phases of the life cycle.
Yeah, so it's really these are really amazing journeys that these animals go through, aren't they?
Oh yeah, I mean they can cover thousands of kilometers out in the ocean, and think about eels, for instance, or salmonid fish, salmon-related species. They really migrate long distances.
Yeah, it's really impressive. And I think in terms of so they're really interesting animals, and these life cycles they're quite intricate and interesting to do research on. But I think there are also a few less fortunate reasons that we should be paying attention to these migratory fish species. And so I read a report that was published a couple of months ago that painted quite a sad picture about what's happening to migratory freshwater migratory fish, since it estimated that globally populations had declined by about 76% over the last 30 years. And that for Europe, the figure was even more alarming, with an estimated population decline of about 93%. So I was wondering, as someone who has been working in this field for a long time now, what are your thoughts on these trends, and what do you think are the main threats that could be responsible for this?
Well, I've been working in the northernmost Europe most of my career, so in this area we don't have quite that kind of rates of decline over that time span. Of course, in the history, we as I already said, we have regulated most of our northern Baltic Sea rivers, for instance. Most of the big ones have been regulated, and there's lots of hydrodams. And this is bringing actually up the one of the most important causes for these declines, and that's the deterioration or total lack of connectivity between habitats, which means that the migratory routes have been blocked, and the river systems and the whole network of different habitats that these species need in their life are fragmented. They're not connected anymore, and that is, of course, very, very crucial for the species to complete their life cycle. That's most likely the reason number one. Then there are issues about water quality, obviously, and especially the further south you go, or the further towards the densely populated areas you go, the problem gets bigger, quite obviously, and so forth. Then we have, of course, the big CC, the climate change, which is also having its impact on river systems, conditions, possibilities for species to survive in systems and conditions which are altered so much during the recent decades because of some human influence. The overall land use practices, that is the big question. How are the drainage areas, the catchments of river systems, used for different purposes? What are the priorities, and what are the conflicting interests in land use? And then I think we are rolling back to the connectivity issues. That if the habitats are not connected anymore, that's the end of the story for most of the migratory fishes.
Yeah, so like with so many of these issues in conservation and ecological restoration, it's generally a very complex topic with many different fronts that people can work on. But if we focus a little bit on this idea of connectivity, which you highlighted as one of the biggest, as probably one of the biggest threats for these species. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how exactly these barriers have an impact on the fish. So are they actually, is it mainly a matter of restricting available habitat, or are they leading to higher mortality at different stages of the life cycle? So what's the actual, how does this impact actually work?
Well, it depends on the type of the barrier or the severity of that barrier. If the barrier is a total blockage of a migratory route, for instance, if that is blocking off the route, then that's it. I mean, the fish can't migrate past that point. That is, of course, and then we are talking about the lack of connectivity. We are talking about a fully fragmented system, which has areas with no connection between those areas, and that is very bad. That's crucial for migratory fish. Then there are partial barriers, some kind of barriers that are decreasing the potential for successful migration by, say, slowing down the migration speed, which is mostly very often causing some kind of issues with predation, for instance. If the fish are staying in some area for a prolonged, unnaturally long time, it typically is combined with some kind of mortality factors and reduced survival. Then there are issues with sedimentation, for instance, which is the physical alteration of the rivers caused by these barriers and dams. Of course, huge changes in the overall hydrology. The running waters turn into a chain of impoundments rather than being a free-flowing river with rivulet sections and pool sections and runs and whatever waterfalls. So the entire nature of these systems is very strongly changed because of dams and well, in this case, I'm mostly talking about the hydrodam development, which means that the large scale dams which are changing the whole structure of the systems.
Yeah, it's really impressive how many changes these structures actually have, and for someone that starts to learn more about these issues, I think it's quite easy never to look at dams in the same way. You start to appreciate more what the difference is between a free-flowing river and one that's impacted in this way. So I was thinking, from what you're describing, it's very clear that these barriers pose a serious threat to freshwater ecosystems. But I was also wondering a little bit how bad this issue is, because I mean, for me, one of the things that really surprised me as I researched more about this topic is the actual sheer number of barriers that actually exist. I was reading on the website from Dam Removal Europe that there was about 1 million identified barriers in Europe alone. And I found this quite impressive. So are these mainly hydropower dams, and do you have an idea of the scale of this issue?
Well, there are all kinds of dams, of course, and when I'm talking about dams and the big issues with migratory fishes, I'm quite easily turning my thoughts towards major rivers, major hydropower dams. But the reality is much more diverse. We are looking at all kinds of small, old middle dams and dams for restoring some kind of a desired water level in certain areas, like in close to communities or whatever purposes. So it's really a diverse spectrum of all kinds of structures that actually constitute different types of dams. And we shouldn't be overlooking and underestimating the impact of small dams to small systems. There are crucial, actually, these kind of small systems in many ways. They can be, for instance, some species like brown trout are very widely using these smaller scale systems, and even very small creeks and streams, and even a tiny small dam in that which from a human perspective doesn't look very dangerous, can be actually something which is totally blocking off the access to the habitats upstream. And there are interesting studies around which actually show the short and longer perspective impacts on what kind of changes you can actually achieve by removing even the small dams, which do not necessarily look that bad. So it's a big variety of things. I'm not that good in numbers and telling you how many dams of this and that size are in Europe, but they are many, as you just said. That's for sure. And it's a big variety of all kinds of dams in different situations for different purposes.
Yeah, and that's really fascinating what you just mentioned about the potential of the impact of these relatively small structures as well. So that's one of the things that drew me to this topic, actually. The idea that even like relatively small structures and potentially small projects in terms of addressing that issue, that barrier, could have a large impact on the ecosystem. But before we actually go into this idea of dam removals, I was thinking that maybe it would be worthwhile to talk a little bit about other solutions that have been proposed to address the issue of dams and the barrier that they pose for migratory fish. So one of the solutions that's been around for a long time, I believe, is this idea of using fish passageways. Could you explain a little bit what a fish passageway is, and then we can discuss maybe how effective they actually are?
Well, there are all kinds of fish passage solutions. I mean, different technical solutions. Something called a nature-like fishway would be basically the closest you can think of a natural channel. That's basically a new channel that's been excavated and built around a barrier, around a dam. And there are solutions like that in different scales, very small ones and also fairly large ones across Europe. And I think these are the ones that are becoming more and more popular, because not only do they serve as passage for fish migrating, but they also serve as a passage for other organisms that may not have the strength or the speed or the capability of negotiating, say, high velocity levels, flow velocities in some more technical fishways. So these nature-like passages are something that are under development, and I think they are getting more and more popular, and people are basically asking for such solutions. They also enable, for instance, that they can actually constitute some kind of juvenile nursery habitat and even spawning areas in some situations. So not only a passage, but also part of the habitat can be created, or at least improved or increased through these channels. Then there are all kinds of technical fishways, the kind of traditional concrete walls with some kind of ladders and steps. They are called different names, and weirs and vertical slots and all kinds of structures. And then there are some kind of lifts which are functioning based on different technologies. But it's a fairly long history of attempts to get some kind of passage around barriers and dams in particular. So there are different solutions, and some of them seem to be working better than the others. And as I said, the natural type of passage would be probably the most preferred one in most cases. But of course, that is depending on on the situation.
Yeah, I can imagine this is a whole world and could be the topic of a episode on its own.
Oh yeah.
But one thing which I thought was interesting, I think I heard you mention on a talk, was this idea that even if you have a relatively high passage efficiency for one barrier, for one dam, if you have a river with multiple dams, then quite quickly the chances of the fish actually making it up or downstream would be very low. And this is something that's like relatively simple probabilities, but I thought it was very interesting. Could you maybe explain that idea a little bit?
Well, yeah, that's something which is very often somehow overlooked as well. That a solution for one dam, that's one thing, and then you can aim at something which would be a relatively high proportion of fish passing, some kind of success rate, which might be 80 or 85 or 90 or something like that. And but then the situation is very different if you think of multiple dams which are in the same river, so there's a cumulative effect of those dams. So if you cut some percentage at each dam after 5, 6, 7 dams, you just calculate that it's not very much fish left, which means that this is something that should be kept in mind. The cumulative effects of dams both ways. It's not just that the fish are migrating upstream. It's a question of how do the juveniles or the spent fish which have spawned have a safe passage downstream, and how much is this effect of cumulative effect of multiple dams actually affecting the whole life cycle at different stages. So this is a very important topic.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how having like an understanding of the whole river, of the whole ecosystem, is quite important in terms of addressing how effective some measures can be. And this is I think it's a great example of that.
Mm.
So in terms of another solution or another approach that has been taken in terms of addressing falling the falling abundance of these migratory fish populations has been to use restocking schemes. But some of these seem to have some unintended consequences as well, from my understanding. Could you expand a little bit about the potential and the limits of fish restocking?
This is a question that's been raised very often, and this is a question which is also raising sometimes emotions. It's the question about whether the fish are wild or whether they are not wild, whether they are produced in aquaculture or somehow manipulated, man-made fishes. This actually boils down to the question of the goal of restoration, goal of conservation. What are our goals? How far up in the kind of list of ambition or preferences do we aim at? When we are talking about, and I should probably also mention that this is also a matter of what is the starting point. If we start from scratch, if we start from a situation where there is no fish whatsoever in this particular river system, for instance, or has been no fish since, I don't know, World War II or something like that, so or 100 years, we need to start somewhere. You can think of just the natural colonization and say that, okay, we open the passage to the river and the fish will come. Some fish will. There are good examples, for instance, in North America on the East Coast, where they removed some dams in rivers and they got immediately big returns of, say, river herring species, which are not salmonid fish species, but other species. For Atlantic salmon, for instance, this path would be very, very slow, because they have the homing instinct. They basically return back to their home river. So just opening up a river system for the fish to come in a situation where there are no fish actually from that river that would have this instinct of homing and returning back to that very river. It means that only some kind of strays, some kind of fish exploring new habitats, there's always part of the population doing that. It's very, very necessary for the population. Otherwise, say, after the last glaciation, we would not have fish in Northern Europe at all, if no fish would have returned to the rivers. So there's always part of the population doing this, but it's a slow road. The question is that, do we, human beings and the managers and the conservationists and someone, do we have the time to wait for that? In those situations, I think stocking could have a role. We could start with something. In some cases, there are even live gene banks which do have fish and eggs and basically genes from those populations that used to live in those areas. For instance, in Finland, we have such possibilities. Then the question is that should we start some kind of rebuilding using these resources that are available in the live gene banks, for instance?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I was just thinking in terms of this idea of the gene banks and the genetics as well. So the idea is that these populations are largely locally adapted, right? So that the actual genetics matters so that they can actually complete their life cycle in a specific river or at least in a specific region. Is that right?
Oh, yes. And that's very important thing to consider very carefully. Because in situations which would not be quite this bad, as I just described, that would have, say, there is some part of the population still there. It might be in a very bad shape, but there's still some reproduction going on, and the original genetic base is still there, or at least part of that. We have seen such situations in the Baltic Sea area, for instance, in Baltic salmon restoration programs, that when you have some kind of fraction or part of the original wild population still there, you don't need to start from scratch. There is something there that can actually be a very quick recovery if the other conditions allow those animals to return, reproduce, produce offspring, which are then again completing their life cycle in the Baltic Sea in this case, and returning and so forth. We have seen quite quick recoveries of wild populations in Baltic salmon, for instance. But that requires that there are fish that actually can do that. Otherwise, you need to do something about that, or you need to wait for a very long time.
Yeah, it's encouraging to know that there are some reasons for hope here.
Oh yeah. There are some success stories that people should know about them.
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of in a case like the one you just described, where there's still some, even though it's not in its most wild and pristine state, but if there's still some remnants of a population in a river, is there a danger that restocking schemes actually make it harder for the fish that are already there and that are locally adapted to thrive? Yeah. So is there any risk of competition? Or
oh yeah, there's definitely a risk, especially if you are using material which is genetically not even close to the original population or from the original population. If you introduce something that is really strange to the environment we are trying to restore, that has typically some negative consequences. Or alternatively, there are also indications that such restocking may not have any impact. It may be totally useless, basically, that you don't actually add anything, and the new genetic, or let's say genes in this case, would be just totally disappear. So. And then it's also something which is a bit frightening, is that it's difficult to predict the consequences. So depending on the situation, depending on the conditions and the circumstances in this or that particular restoration program, it's difficult to predict. So it would be so much better if you could use the locally adapted stocks and perhaps not stock at all, or establish your gene bank from these original stocks. That's something that we did in Finland for some rivers which were totally or almost lost in the past, and in some cases it's been actually quite successful.
That's really interesting. It's really one of those situations where it's not whether restocking as a solution works or not. It's like in a specific situation and considering like specific goals and how you go about doing it, it may or may not be the right strategy. That's what I get from what you're telling me. Yeah.
Yeah, but I would still say that we should be very careful about that. We should be very careful and use stocking as pretty much as the last resort in situation where as I described, which would be totally, I would say, hopeless otherwise.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. So now getting to the solution that we were mentioning before, and that's perhaps one of the most exciting ones, at least for us at Mossy Earth, that we started exploring this, is the idea of dam removals. So I was talking about these numbers, about the number of barriers and dams that exist in Europe, for example. And one thing which I thought was really interesting was to learn that many of these dams are actually obsolete and abandoned, which means that they're not really serving any purpose for the local people anymore. And so these can be seen actually as a great opportunity because they can be removed and increase habitat connectivity. So I was wondering, could you maybe just as an overview tell a little bit about what the advantages are of complete removal of a dam compared, for example, to the use of a passageway. So what are the benefits of dam removal?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think that the answer is somewhere if you think about the kind of the reverse side of the other side of the problems that the dams are creating. Which means that if you remove a dam, you are restoring much more of the entire ecosystem than just opening up a passage for fish. It's about flow, it's about seasonal dynamics, it's about sediments, it's about all elements of the ecosystem that will be more or less, and in many cases more, restored compared to the situation that you just open a passage for fish. It's so much larger scale impact towards what the river system once was compared to just a hole in the dam.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it changes actually the course of the river. It changes everything. Yeah.
The natural processes, including floods, including droughts, including seasonal variation in flow, including in northern areas, ice dynamics, all kinds of affecting and impacts from the physical environment are so much more natural.
Yeah, I think it's really, really fascinating, and for me it really when I was researching different kinds of interventions, it really popped out as an amazing opportunity precisely because of that. Because it's a bit like there's all this talk about rewilding and letting nature return to some extent, and for me this is like just such a clear case of doing that. You're removing a human-made barrier that's causing these issues, and then you're letting the river return to a more wild state. But as with any intervention, there are it's important to do things correctly, right? And as you were mentioning before, things can be unpredictable sometimes. Could you tell us a little bit about what the expected effects of dam removal can be in general, and why is it generally thought to be a good approach to river restoration?
Well, it's the full ecosystem approach, I would say, to the river restoration. as compared to the just fixing some details, like fixing the passage issues for fish with something that would be probably too small anyway. So I think it's a kind of full scale total ecosystem approach, which has the capability and the potential of really affecting so many things in the ecosystem, both in the biological and in the physical environment. So that is the preferable conservation or restoration method for sure. In I would say in most cases. I am personally no real specialist in dam removal issues. In Finland, we have not really been into dam removal projects so far, at least not in any river systems or catchments which would be important for migratory salmonid fishes. At the moment, we have a couple of cases that are under planning. One is in southeast, next to the Russian border, and one is in the far north of Finland. And those two projects are going to be very, very interesting in really seeing what can be achieved by dam removal. The one in the southeast is about landlocked salmon, and landlocked salmon is highly endangered species, and if that is going to be successful, it really can open up new insights and perspectives for conserving the landlocked salmon in general, and especially in this river system that we are sharing with Russia. And in the north, that's about lake-dwelling Ptameros brown trout, a river system running to a large lake, and the large lake is the feeding area for these lake-dwelling migratory brown trout. So this is not a connection to the sea, but rather to a big inland lake. And many of the populations around that catchment, around this big lake, are free, and they are wild populations, and they are migrating long distance, and they grow big, and they are genetically distinct populations and everything. And this one tributary to that lake has been dammed a long time ago with one small hydro dam, and now there's a big consensus actually in actually removing that dam. And we started our kind of before the impact studies this year. We sampled the brown trout populations and took some genetic samples and looked at population structures and abundances and things like that, which is important when we think about the situation, hopefully in a few years' time, when there is connectivity between this big lake and the river. And the brown trout are again free to ascend this river. So it might change. There's a big potential that there will be a genetic change in the population because of this newly opened and, or let's say, this new old passage to the lake is now opened again. So this is something that we are very, very interested in, and we are looking forward to following and monitoring this in the future.
Yeah, this is really interesting, and I look forward to following up on how that how everything goes with that project. I was speaking of monitoring, this idea of before and after monitoring. I understand that you think that this is something that's often overlooked. Is that right? The importance of actually doing proper monitoring in terms of the effects of these interventions.
Unfortunately, yes. I think proper monitoring is often ignored. It's often overlooked. That's something that we start saving the money first, saying that, okay, maybe we don't need to commit ourselves to the next, 10-15 years of monitoring or something. And we just do the job and open the dam or build a fishway, and that's it. Whereas I think that proper monitoring is very, very essential for learning, for actually seeing what happened, which of our actions actually seem to have an impact. What did we do right? What did we do wrong? What were the different consequences of our actions A, B, and C? We need long-term monitoring, and in ideal situation, it would be when we are talking about things like dam removal or opening the fish passage or something like this, it would be so useful and important to have also this before situation covered by monitoring, that we know what the situation was before we made this intervention, before we made this action of restoration or something, and then follow what happened after our intervention.
Yeah.
And ideally, would be very important to compare this time series with another time series where no such change took place. Then we have the control as well, so that it's not just that climate changed, and that's why somebody can argue that it was more floods and then the fish had a better passage and everything was better. It didn't really depend on whether you built a fishway or not, or something like this. So it would be very good to have some kind of control as well. This might be a long shot. I mean, I'm talking about the ideal situation, but nonetheless, monitoring, following up, what are the consequences, what really happened after our actions is very important.
Yeah, one thing I'm interested in is this idea. So you're mentioning long-term monitoring, so several years before and after a dam removal, for example. And I imagine there are of course some effects of a dam removal which are quite on a shorter time scale, that are almost immediate, right? And do you have an idea of, for example, if we're looking at migratory fish, how quickly some of the impacts can start to be seen?
It depends on fish species we are talking about. I mentioned already some examples from other parts of the world, that some species that may not have this homing instinct so precise compared to, say, salmonid fish, which typically have salmon and migratory trout. They typically have a fairly strong, in some species, very strong homing instinct. So they return precisely back to their home river. But some other species may not have such instinct. And of course, those might be, like I mentioned, the clupate fish, which includes the shads and the river herring and things like that, the kind of herring-related migratory fish. They can actually show up in rivers and new habitats very quickly, because they hang around in the estuaries and in the coastal areas, and they just notice that, hey, there seems to be a new passage here, and there seems to be a nice flow of fresh water, and they enter. And in some parts of the east coast of North America, for instance, the Penobscot River in the state of Maine, they have seen, after dam removal, they have seen huge numbers of shad and river herring in a very short time, in only a couple of years. And this is something which is not going to happen with salmon, for instance, because salmon lifespan and the homing instinct does not allow that kind of so quick recovery. So we are talking about more time. We are talking about a generation, or depending again on what kind of intervention we are making. Do we have some restocking going on, or do we rely on the existing population that is there already, or whatever the situation is? But typically the time span involved is longer.
Nice. It's really fascinating, the role that actual proper monitoring can have in terms of also like thinking about future interventions. But I also see it a lot as it being possibly a lever for change. So if you demonstrate that things work in a certain way in one situation, you're creating opportunities and providing support so that it can be done in the future as well, right?
Exactly. The documentation and the kind of bulletproof scientific documentation that this is what we did, this is what happened, is very important for as an example, as a model for other situations, for other areas, or for other whatever. And also, I think a very important part of this is learning. We don't know everything. Many of the interventions or the restoration activities must be pretty much tailored for each situation. It's not like one size fits all. We need to do things that are something we have difficulties in anticipating. We just need to go for something for this purpose and use the best knowledge and best understanding we have. And once we document that by proper monitoring, it's so much easier for the future cases to adjust their actions to their situations based on the knowledge gained from another well-documented situation.
Yeah, this is a really, I think that's really great way to think about ecological restoration. And so in general, not just in the case of dam removal. And I think that it's something that sometimes is not really thought of in that way. Sometimes people want fast results. They want to do things that they know already work. But one thing that we try and do with the projects that we're supporting at Mossy Earth is exactly this, is saying that when we do interventions, they should ideally have this effect on the ecosystem that we are doing them for. But that as much as possible, we want them to be experiments as well, that we're actually collecting evidence and that they will be useful for future interventions as well.
Yeah, that's a very good principle. That's a good one.
Yeah, and being also as much as possible, I think being transparent. I think also with the people who are supporting the work, that they understand that there are things which cannot be predicted, and that they are being monitored, but that it's a learning experience. I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. And so a little bit just to wrap up, I was thinking we've discussed this idea of the different kinds of solutions that can be done to address the issue of freshwater ecosystems and their migratory fish. I was wondering if you have any things you'd like to see conservation organizations and groups doing ecological restoration, if you have any sort of advice or you'd like to see us focus in some areas in particular.
Yeah. Well, I'm working for the Government Research Institute, so I don't know if I should give advice to different types of organizations. But obviously, I think a very important aspect in restoration is restoration of ecosystems and animal populations is awareness among people. These projects and these needs for restoration and conservation must be valuable, must be important and valued in a society. So I don't know so much about the kind of voluntary organizations or the third sector organizations, but I would say that probably this kind of increasing the involvement, increasing the awareness, increasing the kind of change in attitudes and values in society, in ordinary people, that is very important. We have seen here changes in attitude of the past, say, 15, 20 years. How the hydropower production or restoration of river systems and migratory fish populations are now valued and compared and weighed. It has definitely changed. And I think some of the successful projects, the information, transparent information spread from those, dissemination of different kinds, that all helps. And it helps a lot. And when people change their attitudes and the way they think, I mean everybody, it's like the society, then the politicians need to change their attitudes. Then also there is an impact on the industry, the different interest groups for land use or for use of water resources or something. So it's kind of chain reaction starting from ordinary people, from the communities, from the society. And in that respect, I would see a very big role in organizations like what you were representing.
Nice. This is great, and of course with your willingness to join me on this conversation, that's exactly a little bit the kind of thing that we're trying to do, is essentially spread this information that we think can be so important and so useful. I'm very thankful that you joined me today.
Thank you.
Just a quick reminder for our listeners, here at Mossy Earth we have our own rewilding and reforestation projects which you can support through our membership. By becoming a member for just £10 a month, you will be planting 4 trees every month and contributing to the implementation of 6 unique rewilding impact projects per year. You will receive a photo and GPS coordinates for each tree planted and have the right to vote on project decisions. So, if you'd like to join our projects, head over to mossy.earth and become a member today.